Thank you for joining Jennifer Shops and Associates and our 2019 webinar Wednesday series. We're coming to you live from downtown Washington, D.C. Our webinars are every Wednesday, and you can find the upcoming schedule on our website. Past webinars and all recordings are also on our website and on our YouTube channel, along with over 160 other recordings on federal contracting topics. All are complimentary. If you have questions for our speaker today, you can email her directly with the contact information you'll see on the last slide. Here's just a little bit about us. We are a Washington, D.C. based firm and provide services for federal contractors. This ranges from market analysis reports to proposal writing and also post-award compliance. More information is on our website, so please visit us there. We do offer advertising in our newsletter, so please reach out to this email if you'd like more information on that. All right, our speaker today is Nina Shukla. She's going to be covering contract closeouts, record keeping, and retention requirements. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So today we are going to talk about contract closeouts. Our objectives are to discuss what contract closeouts are, the responsibilities of the various parties, overview of the process, highlight some recent changes in the guidance, and finish up with key issues and best practices. Next slide. Next slide. So what is a contract closeout? Well, we look to FAR 4.804-5. A contract closeout occurs when a contract has met all the terms of a contract and all the administrative actions have been completed. All disputes have been settled and final payment has been made. This includes all of those administrative actions that are contractually required, so property, security, patents, and royalties. Working with the federal government, it's great because you've got consistent work and you get paid for what you do. But, getting paid for the work at the end of the contract, that final payment, that can be delayed often for years just due to this contract closeout process, and it can be very arduous. So staying ahead and on top of this administrative burden is really key. Next slide. So the definition on the previous slide talked about administrative actions. We're going to take a look at what that really entails. A contract is administratively complete when the above actions are accomplished. That is, all the releases are executed and final payment has been made. So let's see, some of these administrative actions that are required to close out a contract are: issue the interim contract completion statement, ensure that the disposition of classified material is completed, receive the final patent or royalty report clearance, settle all interim or disallowed costs and complete the price revision, ensure prime contractor has settled subcontracts, settle the prior year indirect cost rates, completed contract audit, the receipt of the contractor's final invoice and voucher, and then complete the contract funds review and de-obligate any excess funds. So contractors will be required to provide to the ACO, the Administrative Contracting Officer, an updated contractor's release of claims and contractor's assignment of refunds, rebates, and credits, certifying that there is no further obligation for either party. Now, contractors do need to recognize that the release of claims really just means that. So if you understated any amounts due to you as a contractor on that final voucher, then those amounts are pretty much gone forever. You can't go back and claim those. So remember, a task or a job isn't finished until all the paperwork is done. Next slide. Now let's look at timeline. So the standard closeout timeframes are governed by FAR 4.804. So as you can see, firm fixed price, 6 months, cost type 36 months, and then all other types of 20 months. Now, for contracts using the simplified acquisition procedures, these would be considered closed when the contracting officer receives evidence of receipt of property and final payment, unless they're otherwise specified by agency regulations. If it is a firm fixed price contract, other than those using the simplified acquisition procedures, those should be closed within 6 months after the date on which the contracting officer received evidence of physical completion. For contractors requiring settlement of indirect cost rates, so i.e. the cost type contracts, these should be closed within 36 months of the month in which the contracting officer receives evidence of physical completion. And then for all the other contracts, these would be closed within 20 months of the month in which the contracting officer receives evidence of physical completion. Next slide. Okay, this is very important because contracts cannot be closed if they're under litigation, or they're under appeal, or if they're in termination, and then until all the termination actions have been completed. This is important to note. Next slide. So we mentioned in that definition physical completion that plays into part when we're talking about timeline and when some of those things kick in, and it's important for closing out contracts. So what is this? Well, we look at FAR 4.804-4. Physical completion is when a contract is considered physically complete when the contractor has either they've completed the required deliverables and the government has inspected and accepted the supplies, or the contractor has performed all the services and then the government has accepted the services, and then all option provisions, if any, have expired, or the government has given the contractor a notice of complete contract termination. That's when you can say that there is physical completion. So it's important, you may have completed the deliveries and the services and performed all the services, but until the government has inspected and accepted those, it's not considered physical completion. So contract closeout is not considered complete just because delivery has been made, or even after the acceptance and final payment. Contract closeout is complete when all the administrative actions of both the contractor and the government are complete. Next slide. So the contract closeout process. It's important because planning and organization are really going to be key here. You don't want to wait for the ACO to tell you, oh, well, now the contracts are ready for the administrative closeout, and then you start to scramble. You want to be, as a contractor, you would like to be proactive in the beginning of this closeout process, be on top of it. And it's very important to note that there is a team effort here. You've got to work together to really close out timely. And you may ask, okay, why do we want to close out timely? Well, it minimizes contract admin costs. It helps to identify the need for additional funds if you do need to pay back the government. And you really must collaborate to determine that all the work has been completed to the satisfaction of the customer. And you have to agree on disbursements that have been made and recorded, because you don't really want any of these things to hold up the process or create issues. So for cost type contracts, the true-up of costs is essential to the contract closeout process to ensure that the contractors receive all the money that they're entitled to. That includes any contract withholds, the audit of the incurred cost proposal, or if applicable, the low-risk memo. That's going to determine the actual allowable direct and indirect costs for cost type contracts. Contracts that are marked physically complete complete on Schedule L and on Schedule O of the incurred cost proposal indicate to the ACO that these contracts are ready for the closeout process. Disbursements made are then and recorded are then compared to those actual costs incurred to determine the final payment, if any. So beware of the timelines for the contract type. After settlement of the final indirect rates, the contractor then has 60 days to update the cumulative cost Schedule L and 120 days to submit the final voucher. Next slide. Let's talk a little bit about quick closeouts. So this is specified in FAR 42.708. And when does this apply? Well, it applies when the contract is, again, we're going to talk about physically complete, when the unsettled direct costs and indirect costs are considered relatively insignificant. So this was, okay, they're insignificant if they are less than $1 million or less than 10% of total contract or task order or delivery order amount. And then the contracting officer would perform a risk assessment and determine if the use of the quick closeout is going to be appropriate in this situation. This includes any consideration of accounting, estimating, and purchasing systems. So now, as part of this risk assessment, they're looking at concerns that the cognizant contract auditors may have, any other information, such as like the history of approved indirect cost rates, any changes to the contractor's rate structure, rate fluctuations, any M&A, how to use that judgment in this process to see whether you qualify for this quick closeout. Next slide. Now, I'd like to mention some of the changes to this process, at least to the threshold. So there's a DoD memorandum dated May 3rd, 2019, applicable effective of that date, where it removes that $1 million that we just mentioned and that 10% threshold, and it replaced it with a single increase threshold of $2 million. This also allows the ACOs to negotiate the settlement of direct and indirect costs prior to the determination of the final direct rates and the indirect rates. Significant change. Now, the DoD issued a final rule on April 30th, 2019 to implement sections of the financial year 17 and 18 National Defense Authorization Act. And these actually permit expedited closeout of contracts entered into at least 17 years prior to the current fiscal year. And there's some additional criteria that's listed. I'm not going to get into those right now. But, why you may ask, okay, why were these changes necessary? So a 2017 report from the GAO documented issues when conducting contract closeouts, as well as the audit backlog that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. And these closeouts should be completed within 6 to 36 months of physical completion, depending on the contract type, as we just talked about in the timeline. But instead, the historic incurred cost audit backlog, and couple that with the 36-month closeout time window, you were seeing that a contract closeout timeline maybe nearly 5 years. So something has changed. And this really does give a little bit more negotiation and discussions to the contracting officers to apply this quick closeout. So good changes for the contractor here. Next slide. So prolonged contract closeouts. Well, they increase risk and they increase the cost. Some of the issues when you've got that prolonged and delayed process are that locating contract files and documentation. The longer you leave something, the harder it is to find it. The personnel with the knowledge that's no longer there. You've got personnel changes. So somebody who, if you're talking about 2 years, those people who dealt with it and may have had that understanding may no longer be there. And the information that they had, if it wasn't written down, it's in their head, and they're just not present. ACO changes. Again, you may have these contracting officers who were aware of the situation and the history that may no longer be there. So again, they're going to require more documentation, prolonged records retention periods. And then, the contracting officer being under pressure to deobligate the funding prior to the settlement of the final cost. Next slide. Some of the contractor responsibilities in closeouts are the incurred cost proposal. You want to prepare and submit within 6 months of your fiscal year end. Interim vouchers, true up within 60 days after the settlement of the rates. You must close out subcontracts before the prime contract. This is very important. And then the final voucher preparation is due 120 days after the settlement of rates. So what should you do? If you're using storage boxes, label them, know what's in the box, do regular IT backups, make sure you manage subcontracts adequately. Don't depend on the government to keep good records. You really want to be proactive there. Timely complete audit responses. Standardized procedures related to your procurement and accounting file organization. Make your life easier in terms of documentation. Next slide. Subcontractor management. So the prime is responsible for closing out the subcontract. And what does that entail? Determining the final rates and audits of subcontracts if applicable. So the prime is essentially responsible for all the requirements that the government has to close out prime contracts, which we've talked about. It does require the determination of the final rates, the audits of subcontracts if applicable. The government doesn't perform the subcontract audit if it's applicable unless that subcontractor is large enough. So what you end up seeing is that it's generally falling to the prime contractor. So you want to try and close out subcontracts in real time whenever possible. You want to avoid the audit of the subcontractor costs when possible. So try and negotiate fixed price subcontracts when possible as opposed to cost. And then document that process and any negotiations held at closeout. So if there is any questions, you have that all documented nicely that you can refer to. Next slide. Retention periods. So this is under FAR 4.7. Generally, information relating to contract negotiation, administration, and audit records are required to retain for 3 years after that final payment, unless it's otherwise specified in the contract. And then financial and cost accounting records and acquisition and supply records, that is generally 4 years from the end of contract to fiscal year, in which it allocated a cost to the government contract. Some of them can be 2 years too, but if you refer to the guidance, it lists it all out. So you're aware of what those periods are. It's important to know because some different things have different time periods. So you want to make sure you're following those. Next slide. Best practices. So we kind of talked a little bit about this, but be proactive. Do not wait until the ACO is the one who's telling you that this is the contract closeout process. Track and maintain documentation, so standardizing the procedures. Knowing where your information is labeled will make it a lot easier, especially when you've got many different contracts that you're managing. And if you standardize that, even if you have personnel that leave, you've got things documented and there's a procedure that's being followed. So the new personnel who are there should be able to follow that fairly easily too. And then timely and adequate incurred cost submissions. The better on top of this you are, the easier and smoother the process for the closeout becomes as well. And then the last one is very important. Manage those subcontractors, because it is the prime's responsibility to manage those. And so, if it falls down to you, you've got to make sure you're on top of that. And that's all we have today.
Thank you so much, Nina, for joining us. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at the phone number or email shown on your screen. And this concludes the webinar. Thank you.